Well, hello and welcome to After the Sermon, a Bethany podcast where we have the privilege of digging deeper into Sunday messages. I am Tami and today I'm joined with Cathy Musto. We are thrilled that you're here.
Thank you.
And Steve Musto, welcome back from a working vacation, guys.
Yeah.
I heard
Thank you. But she did way more work than I did.
You did? Okay.
Yeah, that needs to be stated right from the front.
Good to have you back. Part of the reason we have you here, Cathy, is the verses that we are going to be looking on are specifically talking about husband and wife. And what better way to do this than have a husband and wife team join us? So I'm just going to go ahead and read the verses, and then we will jump in. So you are going to be preaching from Ephesians 5:22 through 33. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, because the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. He is the Savior of the body. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives are to submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her to make her holy, cleansing her with the washing of water by the word. He did this to present the church to himself in splendor, without a spot or wrinkle or anything like that, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands are to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hates his own flesh, but provides and cares for it, just as Christ does for the church, since we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This mystery is profound, but I am talking about Christ and the church. To sum up, each one of you is to love his wife as himself, and the wife is to respect her husband. So I need to confess, as I read it, I almost stumble on the word submit. That's a hard word.
Yeah, we all do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, okay, let's start. Because before we jump in, I actually want to talk about that. Mm-hmm. I want to ask about that submission word. Mm-hmm. What I grew up reading this from the one being told to love, and someone else would have to submit to me. So I want to know, girls growing up reading this or reading this as a woman in the church, what did you think? What hit you? What was your assumption about it?
You go first, ma'am.
Yeah, I think growing up in a traditional Christian household, being taught the submission piece, there was an honor to it. I mean, I didn't have necessarily experience where it was a power play or anything was overt, but there was an honor in submitting because it was a biblical standard. But along with that, I think because it wasn't necessarily explained well, it became more about a position of submission, and not necessarily one that happens in an equal place.
So more a position and not an attitude or a heart thing or
a
something
position
like that.
Instead of a decision. Yeah. I mean, it was not
like you didn't have a choice.
You didn't have a choice.
Okay.
Right. It was a place I was in, or supposed to be in, or that women in general were in.
Yes.
It wasn't this is a lifestyle that we live out as women. That is a good and honorable thing. And that, takes all kinds of, takes on all different kinds of characteristics, but that was just kind of how I grew up looking at it and believing.
All right.
And I didn't grow up in a Christian home.
Yeah.
So this was all very foreign to me. When I became a Christian when I was 11, but we really weren't learning about submitting as wives in our youth group. And so I just know how Andy and I love the Lord and how we danced. And I think there's a mutual respect and mutual submission that we have for one another. Over the years, I have heard my brothers speak of this in ways that has been really hard to stomach. I have seen, I am the leader, I am the head, with men who don't crack open their Bible, and their wives are submitting to the Lord and loving the Lord and studying, and somehow their voice has been heard more. And I've wrestled with this because of that. So I know I had shared with you guys before we started, our daughter has really wrestled. She grew up here. She grew up in a conservative Christian home in so many ways. And she is seeing this be taught, seeing it be lived out. And there is anger. And she's like, Mom, you duped me, because if this is what it's supposed to be, I never saw Dad lord over you. I never felt like he was the leader and you had to follow. I saw two people who loved each other desperately and mutually submitted to one another and served each other where they had the better gifts. And so even though that may have looked traditional, she never felt like Dad mowed the lawn because the man has to, and so she's wrestling as she's seeing it played out in some unhealthy ways. So, the irony is,
she's probably wrestling because she saw it done right.
That's right.
So now she feels like, well, wait a second, I didn't know there was something behind that. I just thought, well, because that's how it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
It is where this comes down is that mutual submission. So let's talk about it. Let's talk. First of all, as always, pray for me.
Okay.
as we do this, because there's a lot of that in the room.
A lot of hurt.
None of us like to be told to submit to anything. Anything.
It's a don't tell me what to do. Kind of.
Right.
Sure.
Right. I don't like the rules at Quick Trip where I have to get so many different check-ins before I get the 5 cents off a gallon.
Okay.
I don't want to submit to that. I want my 5 cents off a gallon.
Right.
So imagine something this important. And we do have several generations of women, and next week we'll talk about children who have endured abuse.
With this as the guardrails,
as the backdrop.
Yep.
Yeah. I'm not only am I allowed to do this, but I'm supposed to do this to you as a man. And so, there's a lot of hurt and there's a lot of pain.
Well, and it's hard too, because if we look at the end of verse 5, we're supposed to submit to one another. If we look at David's sermon last week, and slaves and masters are being brought down to this plane, and so we're all slaves. Submit doesn't even make sense. We're one body, So
we start reading this passage in verse 22, and we need to start reading it in verse 21.
Yep.
We
do.
It's all part of that idea. And that's why I asked David to start the message and don't get drunk on wine, which leads to reckless living. Which doesn't have anything to do with slaves and masters, it would seem, but it's part of the household codes, which is, hey, when we get together for worship, when we are coming together as a church, here's some specific things that we need to talk about as a church. So I'm going to give you some theology about all of this stuff, but then now he's going into the household codes. Now he's talking about the things that are part and parcel of the church and the marriages that most people are in. So one of the things we'll talk about this weekend in the message is the kinds of marriages most Christians are in the ancient world is not in the Gentile world in particular is not what marriage is for us today. It's a completely different thing.
So the Bible was written for you, but not to you.
Yes.
So help us understand what they were hearing then.
Yeah. So marriage is, by this point in the Roman Empire, the polygamy doesn't exist anymore. So that's great. But we live in a culture that is still built on many biblical values. One of them is when people get married, they are not thinking, well, when we get divorced, here's what I need to make sure that we do. They're not thinking that.
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not. Divorce is a tragedy in our world. Right. In their world, divorce is an expectation.
Okay.
Most people would be married multiple times. You just got married, you got divorced. You got married, you got divorced. It's not a big deal in their world. So men had all the power, of course. They were not only able to, they were expected to visit prostitutes, to have girlfriends, mistresses on the side, to have sex with both male and female slaves. If you were a freedman, you had sex with male and female slaves. really, you could have sex with anybody you wanted as long as it wasn't somebody else's wife. That was the deal.
That was taboo.
Right.
Okay.
Women could not have sex with anybody but their husbands.
Okay.
That was the deal. Women also were expected to take on their husbands' gods, their husbands' opinions, their husbands' beliefs. One of the best things you could do, according to the ancient philosophers, was to be quiet when your husband was speaking and nod along with him and just support his opinion, no matter what he said, no matter what he did. You were supposed to take
even if you
his
didn't
opinion.
agree with it.
Right, yeah.
Okay.
Support him publicly. And this was all part of something else that's a big deal, and that's the honor and shame culture.
Which we do not have in
the United States.
Okay.
So our Asian friends,
Yeah.
a lot of our Asian friends, Korea, Japan, China, Vietnam, they have much more of a culture of this. The Middle East has a culture of honor and shame.
Okay.
And honor and shame, honor is a commodity, but it's a limited commodity. There's only so much of it.
Okay.
So in order for one person to get their way, someone else has to lose. It's a lot like politics, actually,
Okay.
today.
Okay.
It's because it's not enough anymore. If I get my way, we used to compromise. Congress used to compromise. Like, I'll give a little bit of this,
Okay.
you give a little bit of that. They don't compromise. There's no compromise anymore.
Okay.
I have to win. I have to get everything I want, and I have to burn down your house and steal your car, or else I haven't won. It has to be a complete destruction.
Because if you win at all, I lose.
Exactly.
Okay.
So for you to get your way over me, you steal some of my honor. And remember, I only have so much of this. It's limited.
Okay.
You take some of that from me. That's a big deal. So when you look at submission in that way, when you look at honor in that way, you realize why this is such a big deal and why Paul says submitting to one another. Wait a second. No, wives are the ones who submit. Husbands don't submit. No, submit to one another in the fear of Christ. So that's sort of the basis
Okay.
for all of this.
So I want to say, why did Paul put it there? I mean, because he's saying submit to one another, but then he's telling wives. So why is that God's perfect plan?
Yeah. Why is God? That's a good question.
Sorry.
Yeah. Verse 31, Paul tries to make that, at least give a nod to that.
Okay.
Because verse 31 is a quote of Genesis chapter 2, I think it's 2:28. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So this is an explanation of the first marriage. This is what marriage actually is. But then Paul adds his own little piece to that where he goes, we don't understand what that means. We don't get it. There's a mystery involved here that is the joining of two into one. So instead of Cathy and I, instead of Cathy losing when I win, or Cathy only being able to win when I lose, Paul's radical teaching is, do you not understand that you're not two entities, you're one? So when you're one entity, when you lose and you win, it all balances out. It's not in those terms. You both are doing this together.
So if Cathy wins, Steve really does win.
Yes.
Cathy, if you win, she really wins.
Then she wins.
Okay. So it sounds like you grew up in a beautiful place where it was modeled well and you came into marriage with a good attitude.
I did. My parents had a great marriage. I think, though, a lot of it, there was a lot of assumption. And I think we all grow up with that, similar to your daughter. What you see, you assume certain things about it. And what I think, as I've been thinking through this week and we've been talking, the idea of submission, I think a lot of times within the church takes on an attitude or an understanding that women think that this means that we don't have a voice, that we aren't supposed to speak into things, that our husband's way is supposed to be the right way. And it silences us, and we don't feel equal because we're not being heard. And when we look at this, that's not what's intended at all. Submission, as we have played out in our marriage and as I have come to understand, is having a voice, is having an opinion about things. It's about bringing my cares, my concerns, my desires, my personality, my, gifts that God has given me, and bringing them to the table so that we can look at them together, and then intentionally making a decision to say, how are we moving forward?
Yeah.
It doesn't lessen who I am as a woman. It leaves me as equal, but it certainly is intentional in how I'm.
I know David and I always talk about better together, men and women here at Bethany, and walking with both legs, not just one.
Yeah.
And I think historically it's been easy just to walk with one leg. We've kind of limped along. And so I am thrilled what God is doing. Even my position and what I'm being asked to do is this church values women. And so that's encouraging. But one of the, I guess I will say, analogies that I've used when I've asked for women's voices to be heard is I hope I haven't said this on the podcast yet, but maybe I have. I have a dear friend who is as Caucasian as they come, and she adopted a little lamb from Africa. And even though she had power and authority and leadership over that little girl, she knew it was wise to ask her sisters that have darker skin and hair that's different from her sleek, hair. How do I love this little lamb well?
Sure.
And so ask those questions and listen to those voices. Right. I think we have gentlemen here at Bethany who want to hear our voices, to love us well as they are making decisions.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's what I want. And that's what I think we are trying to do here at Bethany. I'm sure we always have room for improvement. Because I have also heard men say, God chose men. And that would really, like who was cooking the meals for them when they were, doing their things. And
and we, just like anything, we can be a little bit too flippant and leave people out. One thing though, that you just reminded me of is, in this whole conversation we have, there are people who are in marriages where sometimes men make decisions, and this is where some of the hurt comes from. Men have made decisions or are making decisions, and they're not Christ-honoring decisions. The whole point of this is driving people to greater holiness. The whole point of this, if you're going to say that men have a greater role or whatever it is, guess what? The onus is on you. Then, men, you better be the leader, the Christ-like leader, because it's about helping your family become more and more like Jesus. So we have a lot of women who've been in marriages and are in marriages where their husbands make terrible decisions and then turn around and tell them to submit to that. And to that I say, no. No, absolutely not. Right. You submit to Christ. You're submitting. We're all submitting to Christ. To the degree that your husband is in submission to Christ in this thing, there's not some like magical, mystical, I just submit because because I have to about everything. No. As we are submitted to Christ, I submit on this thing. And it's both ways. Yeah. So if Cathy says, I want to do this thing, or I think we should pursue this thing or whatever, and that is not of Christ, my responsibility is absolutely not. We're not going down. I'm not going to walk down that road with you. And she has the same right to say that with me. We submit to one another as we submit to Christ.
Yeah, we like to rip this out of context and talk just about wives submitting to your husbands. And that's not the full picture. That's not the entire passage. Right. Because when it does play out in that way, it's a beautiful thing. It's what your daughter sees. It's the back and forth, and it looks like equality because it is. Which goes back to David's message from last week, because you're bringing yourself down to lift the other person up, and to be with each other in that, to submit to each other, to love each other in a way that is humble and kind and intentional and Holy Spirit filled. And when you do that well, it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful dance back and forth.
Yeah.
Hard stuff though, for some people.
Sure.
I feel bad. I mean, I've told you I've been praying for you in a different way, just because handling the word of God is a real thing. But know that there are going to be some that hear the word submit. They're going to react, and they're going to turn their ears off to what you have to say.
Right.
They sit in a wedding and they hear this passage be read, and they feel like they're being gagged with a pitchfork. And so we will pray that we have ears to hear.
But that's part of the problem.
Right.
Part of the problem is that if we had handled this well, if this had been handled traditionally well by the church, that would be this would be a sought after thing. We wouldn't look at submission as a bad thing. If we understood what submission was, we wouldn't look at it as a negative thing. We would look at it as net positive, and we just simply don't. We also have people, by the way, who are in marriages where one's a believer and one is not. And that changes everything.
Yeah, it does.
So, there are certain things that when I said a couple weeks ago, there are not a lot of thou shalts and thou shalt nots in the Bible, but there are some. And one of the things that God's word is very clear on is, if you're a believer, marry a believer. This is a big deal. It's not a suggestion. And when we just kind of blow that off and we shrug and we say, I got a better idea. I fell in love. We'll figure it out. Whatever it is we're saying, when we do that, this is never going to work. This is never going to work. It's not you can't have a good marriage or a happy marriage. That's not it. This is never going to work. This is not the right model.
And if marriage is to reflect Christ's love for the church, that can't happen if you're not.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
and that's painful for me to say.
Yeah.
And that's painful for people to hear. But as we have said, Cathy and I have said many times, we have sat with an awful lot of grieving people, and one of the deepest griefs we have ever seen is walking with people, mostly women, through their Christian life without a believing husband. It is one of the deepest griefs around.
Yeah.
I will say, though, that hearing you say about, hearing the word submit creates a reaction.
Well, I almost it doesn't want to roll off my tongue. If I'm honest with you, it's not easy.
Yeah. And so, I think the thing that, because I have been there and I've struggled through this over the years, and because it's hard. I think the thing that I always come back to is looking at Jesus' example. And you see it in Philippians 2, where he says he sets aside his rights, where he comes in humility. He sets those things aside. He submits to the will of the Father, not because he's not equal, but because out of love. Yep. And once I was able to grasp that if I'm going to submit, I'm going to be like Jesus.
Yeah.
Like he has to, he doesn't have to, he chose to do that. Who am I to not choose that? So that was a huge turning point for me in being able to swallow that submit word, just because I want to be like Jesus. So I can do that.
Yeah.
And we can trust Jesus.
And we can trust him.
If we're submitting to him, we can trust.
Yep.
So I have a friend who is no longer with us, and he was a pastor. And so I have a file on my computer called John's Treasures, and he did happen to preach through Ephesians. And so that's super fun for me when I can see John's heart.
Awesome.
And in this, he basically said to the gentleman in his church, if you ever say to your wife, you need to submit to me.
Yeah.
You must submit to me. You are in sin.
Yeah.
And so I was like, whoa, John, those are some strong words. Would you agree? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. And I was actually thinking the other day, of saying something similar in the message about if you have to do that, you're doing it wrong.
Right. It's kind of like, you will respect me. You don't respect anyone that demands your respect.
That's right.
Would you? Yeah.
That's right. So yeah, that's good. And it's absolutely right. I mean, most of the men who say that, generally speaking, most of them are not worth respecting.
Right. Respecting.
And that's one of the problem, you'll hear me say this in the message, our problem is not unsubmitted women. Our problem is unrighteous men. That's our problem in the church. Our problem is not that, what is Paul? Okay, let's back up. The Bible's not written to us, written for us. Let's back up. Remember, Paul writes a letter to Timothy, who's the pastor of the church here in Ephesus. And one of the things he says to Timothy is, hey, there's some things going on with the women there. Don't let the women teach. And there's another, it's right up there. Don't let the women teach there in Ephesus. Why? Because there's some things going on that they're believing some things that are not right, and they are spreading some things that are not right. So he talks about this. We see the challenge then of being someone who is not walking closely enough with the Lord or understanding enough with the Lord. If there was ever a time for Paul, understanding the context of Ephesus, if there's ever a time to say, you women are just way too mouthy. You're too lippy, you're too opinionated, because he's already said to Timothy, look, we have some women there who they're just understanding the wrong things, and they want to teach those wrong things, and you can't give them a platform to do that. He can say that. That's not what he says. And so the problem is not the women. The problem is the men. And he's trying to tell the men who are used to visiting prostitutes, who are used to being married multiple times and don't care, who are used to having sex with their slaves, who are used to doing terrible things, knock it off and be Jesus. Be Jesus to your family. Be Jesus. Start with your wife. Be Jesus to your wife. Be Jesus to your slaves. Be Jesus to your children. And don't frustrate them, and show them what it means. And that's kind of the summary of the whole thing. Here's what should happen. Go print John's message and you preach it this weekend.
No, thank you.
And I will...
No, thank you. Oh, no, I am very thankful for him. And I do think that is one of the reasons Andy and I have the marriage that we have. Neither of us came from the healthiest of homes, but we saw a husband and wife love one another well and support each other. And so we are thankful for the Swansons. So,
yeah.
Awesome.
That's good. It's, it's nice when you can take those pieces. My parents didn't do everything right either. Your parents didn't do everything right either, but we were able to take pieces, maybe idealized pieces at times, and do something with them. So that's good.
I think you hit on a really important thing, though, in saying that, reminding each other what the purpose of marriage is. And the purpose of marriage is not to make sure that things go smoothly or having that hierarchy. It's holiness. It's making each other holy. So when you put that in perspective as the goal, doing these things for each other and how we treat each other and love each other and submit to each other creates a holiness within our marriages.
I don't know. I haven't read it in a long time, but I remember years ago reading a book called Sacred Marriage. And one of the questions was, so many of us get married thinking that we are getting married to make ourselves happy. What if God's perfect plan was to make us holy? And
Gary
nothing.
Thomas, I think.
I loved it. I guess I have to go back and look at it again. But I do think oftentimes we get married for the wrong reason.
Yeah.
And just like being married shows you the secrets of your heart and your selfishness, children can do the same thing.
Yep.
And so there's a reason that God is speaking to these things, because it does, if we submit, if we are willing to see the secrets of our heart, we will look more like Jesus at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So here's most of the time how this passage gets taught.
Here we go.
Most of the time, what we say is the pastor reads the passage, makes a couple jokes about it, and then says, but let me tell you what these words really mean, and then spends the rest of the passage unpacking. I want to actually do the opposite here at the end of our podcast.
Okay.
We've talked about the concepts, and I didn't want to pollute the pool.
Okay.
But many of the words that Paul is using here, to quote the great Inigo Montoya, those words do not mean what we think they mean.
There we go. The Princess Bride. Okay.
So we're going to talk about that in the message as well. What does it mean? What does submission actually mean? What does it mean that the husband is the head of the wife? What does head actually mean?
I don't know, but in my Greek wedding, the woman is the neck that turns the head.
That's right.
So we've got that if we're quoting movie lines.
And that is funny, because that is the culture that all this is based on.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's all Greek culture.
Okay.
And ancient Greek culture. And it was based on philosophers.
Okay.
Most of them godless philosophers who were making things up. And we're making things up in order to, once you have power, how much of that power do you want to give away?
Yeah, nothing.
Right. So the people who are saying these things are men. They are men with power and authority, and they hand this stuff down to women and say, you will do this. And
Feels like Simon Says.
Yeah.
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 So I know you're going to tell us what those words really mean.
Yep.
Do we have to wait for Sunday?
You do.
Oh man.
You do. You have to wait. You have to wait for Sunday, but if we will grab on to, because Paul has his choice of using any words in Greek.
And he chose these.
And the words that he chooses are absolutely fascinating.
Okay.
I hope they're as fascinating to everybody else as they are to me, because I'll probably spend a little bit of time there, and sometimes I feel like I geek out to that stuff.
Okay.
But yeah.
We'll love it.
So stay tuned is what I'm saying.
There you go. Well, part of the reason I was so excited that you were having Cathy here is just the year that I have known you guys. I have never seen you speak of Cathy without adoration and love for who she is intellectually, her walk with the Lord, how she worships God. And the same is true for you. And so I feel like I am sitting between a couple who has figured out how to dance this dance well and is a good example. So thank you guys.
Lot of work.
Yeah,
though.
it is a lot of work.
Yeah, a lot of pain, a lot of counseling, a lot of stuff behind all of that.
Yeah, you're seeing the 30 years of marriage, not the year 1 to 10.
Right.
No. And I think Andy and I have a similar story. I will say to him, the first 16 were rough. He's like, babe, they were fine. I'm like, oh no.
Oh no.
Yeah, that's right.
I needed him to be my knight in shining armor. I had a demanding spirit. When I figured out Jesus is enough, our marriage was sweeter. So I was the problem.
Yeah, I tell Cathy we've been married for 30 years and 20 of them have been really good.
There you go.
The other 10 were us just going, who are you?
Yep. How do we do this? So, well, thank you. And thank you for joining us. If you want to prepare for next week, you're going to do 6:1-4, correct?
Yep.
Only 4 verses.
For next week.
You can spend some time digging into those verses. So have a great week. Bye-bye.